Thank you very much for the invitation. It is a very special invitation to me because when I received it, I saw that the occasion was to talk about the Handbook on Basic Principles and Promising Practices on the on alternatives to imprisonment. And as you were kind enough to mention, this is something for which I did the first draft. And I confess, I then went back immediately and reread what I had written. And you know, they say a text develops a life of its own. And in some ways, this text has developed a life of its own. And I have two thoughts about reading it. The one is, it is very, it's written in not my normal style. It's written in trying to write in a UN voice, in a sense. But secondly, it is very much improved by things that I didn't add. So if you go back and you look at the text, you can see that roughly I wrote the text, but the examples which bring it to life came out of conversations in the process. And this made me think, and perhaps it would be interesting to the audience to say that the task of writing such a text is a unique one. This was the first one I did. I've done a couple of others. And in fact, there's one coming out shortly, converting the Mandela rules into draft imprisonment, which I hope members of your audience will find interesting too. It's quite demanding. First thing is they say, would you write it? And you say, oh, I'd love to do that. And you then set off and you sit with a clean sheet of paper and you think to yourself, what could I say which would be of practical use? Because we're writing not to academic criminologists, however, we're writing to practitioners, for practitioners. What would be of practical use to people who want to change and improve things in practice around the world, given all the different societies we have? So you sit and you draw up a little list. I don't normally work on alternatives, and it was a challenge to do that. In any case, I wrote this draft, and then I set off to Vienna the days before COVID. And of course, that was that was true, but it wasn't great fun. I sat there for 2 days doing something like those of you who've done a PhD Viva would know, sat there for 2 days being cross-examined sentence by sentence, comma by comma. And I well remember this. There were two Canadian colleagues in particular who I hadn't met before, who literally questioned every line that I wrote. And they were right. So it is better for that. So what I can say is the opposite of what authors usually say. Usually you say all the mistakes are my own. In this case, you can say all the mistakes are someone else's, but I don't think there's so many when I read it again. So in that case, in that way, I'm quite happy about it. The second thing I did was to think, well, if one has this text, what would I do differently now? And some of that has come out in this already. So where is the UN moved in this area? Kittipong mentioned the Bangkok rules. And I think the Bangkok rules have been a major development for the UN. They led the way in thinking through, in the case of women, not as broadly as the whole, but in the case of women, very clearly the relationship between imprisonment and alternatives. So I think that's a powerful development. I think there are a few others. You'll notice that we look at one point in these at different areas of people who are overrepresented. We speak about women, drug users, children, and then indigenous communities. We don't speak as fully as we should, I believe, about race. So for example, and it's a very interesting example, in the US, there's long been the problem that people who were convicted of offenses of using or dealing in cocaine were treated very differently depending on what type of cocaine they used. Was it crack cocaine or powder cocaine? And if you used crack cocaine, the sentences were almost 10 times longer. And it just happened to be the case. A lot of Black people used crack cocaine, and many non-Black people, if I could put it that way, used powder cocaine. And I was making notes literally this morning on it when I noticed that today, finally, the US Congress has passed something called literally the Equal Act, which removes this. So it's one less thing we can criticize them on, although of course there's much going back. Having said these various things by way of introduction, I think it's important to situate what we were trying to do. I was quite moved by Sarah's powerful exposition of how crime really needs to be understood in terms of equality. She spoke about South Africa, but of course this is true of many, many countries around the world. But we also need to ask ourselves, what can we do in the criminal justice system which would help? And the answer is, firstly, we can't do away with the criminal justice system immediately. Secondly, something that struck me when I was writing this at the time, every country in the world has a prison system. It's amazing. Typically, if you travel around the world, you'll find a prison system, a parliament of some kind, a national museum of some kind. But of course, what matters is not those formalities, but what you do within them. And that, I think, is a point of the handbook. The handbook starts by setting out very briefly its general principles. And it says, if I could quote, this is on imprisonment and human rights. It says, liberty is one of the most fundamental of human rights, recognized in international human rights instruments and national constitutions throughout the world. In order to take that right away, even temporarily, governments have a duty to justify the use of imprisonment as necessary to achieve an important social objective for which there are no less restrictive means with which the objective can be achieved. The loss of liberty that results from imprisonment is inevitable, but in practice, imprisonment regularly impinges human rights. It impinges several other human rights as well. In many countries of the world, prisoners are deprived of basic amenities of life. They're held in grossly overcrowded conditions, poorly clothed and underfed. They're particularly vulnerable to disease and yet are given poor medical treatment. They find it difficult to keep in contact with their children and other family members. Such conditions may literally place the lives of prisoners at risk. Increasingly, human rights courts and tribunals have to recognize that subjecting prisoners to such conditions denies their human dignity. Such conditions have been held to be inhuman and degrading. All too often, the majority of these prisoners may be low-level offenders, many of whom may be awaiting trial, who could be dealt with using appropriate alternatives instead of being imprisoned. Implementing effective alternatives to imprisonment will reduce overcrowding and make it easier to manage prisons in a way that allows states to meet their basic obligation to the prisoners in their care. So we started from that position. And then I really tried to think, going through the whole range of possibilities, what could we do that would work in practice? What could we do? The answer is that not everything could work in every system. And what this handbook is designed to do is to say, it is not easy to reduce the prison population. I listened very carefully to Kitty Pong, whose reforms I've admired over a long time. And I thought maybe we should put that statistic of his in if we ever produced a second edition of this handbook. But the reality was, as he went on to say, it hasn't worked out how I planned it. And I've heard this so often from prison reformers all around the world that one has to have some humility when trying to do this. You have to realize that alternatives at their best can't solve the major problems of inequality, of social disharmony, which exists in so many countries in the world. But we can and we should do what we can. Now, what should we do? Well, the answer lies in looking at all the different stages of the system and seeing where we can improve things. My mentor, the American professor Jim Jacobs, once put it beautifully. He said to me, you know, I went to his American accent, you know, Criminal justice reform is about who you distrust the least. Think about that. Criminal justice reform is about who you distrust the least. So if you have an enormous trust in judges, let us say, you would be opposed to having any form of compulsory sentencing. You'd say, let's give them the maximum discretion at all times. And maybe that will work. In some societies it does, and in some it doesn't. I was very struck. I was doing some years ago, attempting to do some prison reform in a Central African country, writing a new prison act for them. And right at the end, we had to give a little list of offenses, mutiny in prisons, escaping from prisons, and so on, and suggest penalties. And frankly, I looked at what we'd done in South Africa, where I'd done the sort of thing in the 1990s, and I said to them, let's do this. They came to me afterwards and they said, but Professor, that's terrible. You're suggesting a sentence, let's say, for someone who insists on breaking into prison to get his friend out. You're suggesting a sentence of from 6 months to 10 years. I said, well, that's a very wide range. The judges will probably impose an appropriate sentence. I said, no, you don't understand our culture. In our culture, they always impose the maximum. So, well, clearly I was over-trusting the judges and under-trusting the legislature. But legislature is also a problem. It's sometimes said cynically by politicians, there are no votes in being soft on crime. So you have to be able to persuade the politicians of what you could do and what you couldn't do. So it's the best way to use the handbook is to see it as a guide to what could possibly be done, but you need to think it through carefully. So in every chapter, we tried to put in alternatives, and then we tried to say, why could they go wrong? So let me give you, there's one example which I'd completely forgotten, and I smiled when I reread it. It is an Australian example. And in Australia, as many of you know, there's a spectacularly high rate of imprisonment of Indigenous people. And so one of the things they said is what we should do is we should decriminalize the crime of public drunkenness, because for reasons, the same thing Sarah was talking about, of massive social inequality, very high rate of Indigenous people being caught for public drunkenness, put in prison and prosecuted. Absolutely unnecessary, let's do away with it. So they abolished the crime. And you know what happened? The rate of people being arrested for public drunkenness went up. Why? Because in the system they put in place, they said if someone is found publicly drunk, the police should intervene and refer them to the welfare authorities. But how did the police intervene? They arrested them, put them in prison until the next morning, and they did it far more often than they'd done in the past. So very often one has to think through these particular things. If you look at the handbook, you'll see it starts with looking at limiting the criminal justice system's reach. It looks at complete decriminalization, asks you for examples of those. And again, I seem to be thinking of Sarah's talk a lot, but the classic example in apartheid South Africa of that was crimes of brewing illicit liquor, which was in practice mostly done. Illicit liquor was defined in a way that was specifically the liquor drunk by Black people, and particularly most often brewed by women. And just removing that made a very big difference to the percentage of women, Black women in particular, in prison for a short time. But decriminalization is limited. When you start looking around the world, there's not much disagreement about what are the court crimes which fill prisons. You can work on the edges, and you should, but it's not going to be a complete solution. You could look at diversion, but again, there may be problems. And you can, so you're stuck with the reality that you're going to have a system. Next step is, what about pretrial detention? Pretrial detention is a massive problem. It varies a lot. My impression is that in South America in particular, there are the highest percentages. The majority of prisoners in many South American countries are people who have not been convicted. Well, you can do something about it. And you can think of all sorts of practical things doing that. If you come from an Anglo-American type of system, the first thing you're likely to say is, well, give them bail more freely. But we often think in terms of monetary bail. That is, you give the state some money and then you promise to come back for your trial. And if you don't, if you do, the state will give your money back to you. Sounds like a good idea, but it assumes that people have money in the first place, that they're able to do that. So it may not be such a good idea. Okay, well, then you need to try and think of something else. I've recently been talking to the Turkish government on this question, and they were horrified by the idea of monetary bail. I said, well, what do you usually do? And they said, well, we get them to report to police, but the police don't want to be bothered by it. We withdraw people's passports and so on and so forth. The answer may well be in some more community-based controls, but be that as it may, the point I want to hammer is that nothing of this is easy, and you need to think about it at a step-by-step basis. So pre-trials would be one area. Sentencing, alternative punishments would be another area. Of course, that's what the Tokyo rules themselves emphasize the most, that you need to think of alternatives. But that's hard to do, or not as easy as it sounds. Certainly here where I live at the moment, in Nottingham in England, my wife said to me one day, hey, just go and have a look at the school down the road. They're implementing alternative punishment. So I walked down the school of the road, looked, I wasn't really interested. And here were a lot of guys painting the school fence. And they were wearing yellow jackets with community payback on the back of them. Well, is that a good idea? I worried about stigmatism, and then I listened to the local radio. The local radio said, we're really keen on community punishment. You phone in and tell us what good community punishments people can do. Well, I started worrying about this. And then, and I can't resist saying this, when I looked at how well these guys were painting, if I ran that school, I'd rather pay a painter than get these guys standing there. So this isn't, these solutions too, to be taken seriously, but nothing is easy, nothing solves itself. The other thing worth emphasizing, if you're serious about community alternatives, if you're serious about doing other things other than sending people to prison, you have to invest in infrastructure. The biggest problem you get from judges, and I know this again from going around the world, is they say to you, look, I'd love to have an alternative, but I don't know how to do this. It's very difficult. One example, again, I can remember from my days in Cape Town, I went to see the chief magistrate in Cape Town recently there, and I said to him, look, why don't you introduce a system, instead of sending people to prison, that they use more fines? He said, yeah, Professor. I said, well, how do I solve this? He said, how do I do it? I said, well, it's simple. Oh, he said, yeah, but they don't have much money. I said, well, why don't you get them to pay a small amount every month rather than they can't pay a fine and then they go to prison anyway? He said, I can't do that. I said, why? He said, my budget is so tight that I can't hire a clerk to organize the payment of these fines. And I said to him, but sir, that's ridiculous. Of course you could do that. It costs so much less to hire a clerk than to send them to prison. And think of all the terrible things that happen in prison. And he smiled and he looked at me and he said, Professor, you don't understand who pays for the clerk. If I need a clerk, I have to pay if the prisons are in another budget. Now, one can think of ways around that. I've suggested in countries where I've proposed reform, for example, that the cost of keeping people in prison pre-trial should not come from the prison budget, but should come from the police budget. And I'm personally convinced that if you did that, the police would do things much more quickly. Because if you're a policeman, you arrest someone, there's no cost for you to keep that person in prison. In fact, it's your advantage because they may not stand trial. But if you don't do that, But if it were a cost to you, you could say, well, I might get a nice car to drive if I don't have so many people locked up. Now, these I'm exaggerating slightly to try and get you to understand, members of the audience, how practical these things are, and how trivial things can make a difference. Finally, I want to draw your attention to the last chapter of the handbook, which is called Towards a Coherent Strategy. Now, I've told you that I had a hand in writing most of it. In fact, this last chapter was very much rewritten because of the intervention of one colleague who deserves to be named, namely my great Finnish friend and colleague, Tapio Lapasepile. Lapasepile was at this last meeting in Vienna when we discussed it all. And he said, well, I can tell you something about strategies, because Finland is perhaps the primary example in the world of a country that halved its prison population relatively quickly. And he tried to explain how they'd done it. Firstly, they had a political advantage. Their prison population was almost double that of other Nordic countries, certainly of Sweden and Norway. And it was much like the prison population of their neighboring states, Russia and the smaller Baltic states. And they got politicians to run on the ticket. Do you want to be more like Scandinavia, or do you want to be more like the Soviet Union or Russia? And that was an easy political step. The next step was they designed a clear strategy. How are we going to do it? Firstly, they called in their prosecutors and said, from next month, we want you to ask for half the sentences you've been asked for. They had complete buy-in, both from the Prime Minister and from the Minister of Justice, both who, interestingly enough, were former criminal law professors. And then they called in the press and they said to them, look, this is a free country. You can write what you like. We will keep giving you information about crime. But if you want to write a crime story, we ask one thing. We'll give you complete access, but we want you to come and talk it through with us so that we can place it in context. Because one of the biggest difficulties you have in reform is public fear. And public fear is very often generated by press reports. Now, I live in a country where there's an incredible amount of sensational reporting on crime. And it makes it very difficult for any politician to say, well, we should not have, I don't know, compulsory life sentences for every murder or whatever. We live in a country which has one of the lowest murder rates in the world. Nevertheless, we impose life sentence on every murder. No politician in this country will go against that, certainly not now. Why? Because of all the fear generated in the newspapers. We've had a decline in crime for the past 10 years. Nobody wants to talk about it. Why? Because, as I said, being soft on crime doesn't win. So what the last chapter suggests, and it's well worth thinking about, is the combination of a clear knowledge base on causation factors, of the importance of political initiatives, of the importance of legislative reform, of infrastructure, and the importance of being careful of net widening. That's something I haven't mentioned yet. There's a great difficulty with introducing more community sanctions, is that you don't reduce your prison population, but you just end up with more people under the control of the state. Often judges will say to you, well, I really don't know what to do with this guy. He or more really she doesn't deserve imprisonment, but now I have a fancy community solution. So I order them to do that and they can stay with their family and so on. Doesn't solve the problem. So I would emphasize that. I would emphasize the importance of long-term monitoring. Sort of thing that Kittipong was doing in his speech. We need that. We need people looking at where we're going, because what do they say? The road to hell is paved with good intentions. Well, year two, we have that sort of potential problem. You need to think of a media strategy And finally, there are the big ideas, justice and equality, which have to inform us all. Thank you.